There were 4 of us on that trip: me, Lisa, Ben, and Charlie. We had decided to take a weekend off, get away from the endless hum of the city, and camp in the forest. The plan was simple: a long hike during the day, setting up tents in a clearing by evening, and then just relaxing by the campfire under the stars. It sounded like the perfect way to reset, especially after the past few months of stressful work and general burnout. The forest we chose wasn't well known, which was part of its charm. It wasn't on any of the popular hiking apps, and you couldn't even find a clear trail marked online. Lisa had heard about it through a friend, one of those hidden gems that only locals knew. As we drove deeper into the woods, the roads became narrow, winding between dense trees that seemed to press in closer the further we went. There were no signposts, no mile markers, just an ever-thickening sea of green that soon felt like it was swallowing the road. We found a clearing just before sunset, right next to a small, still lake. It was beautiful in that untouched, almost eerie way. The trees surrounding the clearing were ancient, their trunks gnarled and twisting up into the darkening sky. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine needles. It felt isolated, almost sacred in a way. We set up our tents, gathered wood for the fire, and everything felt right. Ben had brought some beers, and we started talking about work, relationships, and the usual banter that came up when you've got nowhere else to be. But as the firelight flickered against the towering trees, the mood subtly shifted. It started with small things. I thought I saw movement in the trees, just at the edge of my vision, where the light met the dark. At first, I brushed it off as nothing more than shadows playing tricks on me. It's what happens when you spend too much time staring into the fire, or when the forest's quiet stillness gets under your skin. But then Charlie mentioned it too. Did anyone else hear that? His voice was low, almost cautious. We all paused, the crackling of the fire filling the silence as we listened. "Hear what?" Lisa asked, glancing around. "I don't know." It was like whispering. I strained my ears, but there was nothing. Just the usual sounds of the forest, the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze, the occasional call of a distant night bird. "Probably just the wind," I said, trying to keep things light. But Charlie didn't look convinced. He stared into the trees for a long time, his face tense in the flickering firelight. That's when I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible murmur. It was so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind through the trees, but it wasn't. It had a rhythm, a cadence that felt deliberate, like words just out of reach. Ben shrugged it off, made some joke about the ghosts of campers past, but I could see Lisa was unsettled too. The air felt different now, heavier, colder. By the time we decided to turn in, the fire was dying down, and the clearing was bathed in a silver-blue light from the nearly full moon. The lake looked like glass, perfectly still, reflecting the dark silhouettes of the surrounding trees. I crawled into my tent, zipped up the flap, and tried to push the unease out of my mind. It was just the forest, I told myself. Forests make noise. Forests have energy. It's nothing. But I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it again. Faint whispering, like it was coming from just outside my tent. The sound would grow, almost like it was circling us. My heart pounded in my chest, and I tried to tell myself it was all in my head. But then I heard something else. A distinct sound that sent a chill through me. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, crunching softly over the leaves and twigs outside. I held my breath, my mind racing. Ben was in the tent next to mine, Lisa and Charlie in the others. Could be one of them, right? But as I lay there, frozen, I knew it wasn't. The footsteps didn't belong to any of us. They were too light, too soft, almost cautious. I heard the steps move past my tent, heading toward the trees. Then, just as suddenly as they started, they stopped. The The whispering, though, that didn't stop. It was getting louder now, no longer indistinguishable from the wind. It sounded like words, though I couldn't understand them, like a language I didn't know, but somehow felt I should. Something was outside. Something was moving, brushing against the fabric of my tent. My first instinct was to grab my flashlight, but I hesitated. I wasn't sure I wanted to see what was out there. Seconds passed, though it felt like hours, and the rustling stopped. The air outside was unnaturally still, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I couldn't hear the others, couldn't even hear the usual night sounds. That's when I heard a faint splash from the lake. I unzipped my tent just enough to peek out, half expecting to see one of my friends by the water. But what I saw was something I still can't quite explain. There was a figure, tall, thin, barely more than a shadow, standing at the edge of the lake. Its form was indistinct, like it was part of the forest itself, its limbs long and willowy, blending with the trees. The moonlight seemed to pass through it, as if it wasn't fully there. But its face, or where its face should have been, was turned toward me. It didn't feel human. And then, as if noticing me, the figure tilted its head ever so slightly, and the whispering returned, louder now, echoing through the clearing. The sound was coming from it, from the trees, from everywhere. My heart pounded in my chest, and I backed away, closing the tent flap, my hands shaking. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the tent walls, listening to the whispers fade into the forest. Eventually, exhaustion must have taken over because I woke up to daylight streaming through the fabric. Ben and Lisa were already packing up, acting like nothing had happened. I wanted to ask if they heard anything, if they saw anything, but I couldn't find the words. Charlie, though, looked pale and distant. He didn't say much as we packed up. The next morning, the air felt thick, as though the forest was trying to swallow us. Ben and Lisa were already breaking down their tents, laughing and chatting like it was just another morning, like none of the strangeness from the night before had happened. I stood there, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, trying to shake off the lingering unease that clung to me. I wanted to ask if they'd heard the whispers, if they'd seen the figure by the lake, but something stopped me. Some strange, quiet dread that made me afraid of their answer. Charlie, though, he was different. He moved sluggishly, his skin pale and his eyes hollow. He hadn't slept, I could tell. There was something in the way he kept glancing toward the tree line, his gaze unfocused, like he was seeing something the rest of us couldn't. "Hey, you okay?" I asked, keeping my voice low. Charlie looked at me for a long moment before nodding, though it didn't feel like the truth. His lips parted as if he wanted to say something, but then he closed them again, shaking his head. "Yeah," he mumbled, "just tired. Let's get going." The plan had been to hike deeper into the forest, find another spot to camp before heading back the next day. Ben, ever the optimist, was already studying the map, excited to explore further. I wasn't thrilled about the idea, but no one else seemed to share my unease. Reluctantly, I packed up and followed them into the forest. As we walked, the atmosphere around us seemed to change. The trees, which had felt so serene yesterday, now seemed oppressive, their branches hanging low, casting long shadows across the path. It was as if the forest was watching us, its silence growing heavier with each step. After a few hours of hiking, Lisa called out from ahead. "Hey, guys, do you hear that?" She stopped, holding up a hand, listening. I strained my ears, expecting to hear the same faint whispers from the night before, but there was nothing, just silence. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an unnatural stillness that made my skin crawl. "Nope, nothing," Ben said, grinning. "You're probably still half asleep." He tried to lighten the mood, but even he seemed on edge. Lisa frowned but shrugged it off, and we continued. But as we walked, I noticed something strange. Lisa, who had been just ahead of me, was no longer there. I stopped, looking around, expecting her to have stepped off the path for some reason. "Lisa?" I called out. No answer. Ben and Charlie were up ahead, so I jogged to catch up. "Hey, where's Lisa?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though I could feel panic starting to rise in my chest. They both stopped, turning to look at me. Ben frowned, glancing around. "Wait, where did she go?" We all stood there, scanning the dense trees around us. There was no sign of her, no footsteps, no rustling leaves. She had just vanished. I turned to Charlie, who was staring at the trees, his face pale. "Did you see her leave?" I asked, but he didn't respond. He just kept staring ahead, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "We should look for her," I said. But even as I spoke, something in the back of my mind told me it wouldn't matter. The forest had taken her, just like it had tried to reach us last night. We spent the next hour searching, calling her name, walking in circles around where we had last seen her. But it was no use. Lisa was gone, and the forest seemed to mock us with its silence. "We should head back," Ben finally said, his voice tight. "She might have gone back to the campsite. Maybe she got lost." I wanted to argue, but something in the air, a thick, smothering presence, made me want to leave. So we turned around, retracing our steps. But as the day dragged on, the forest seemed to change around us. The path we had walked earlier seemed unfamiliar, the trees closer together, the undergrowth thicker. It was like the forest was shifting, trapping us inside. "Is it just me?" Ben asked, his voice shaky now, "or does this path feel wrong?" I didn't answer. I could feel it too. Something was wrong. The air felt heavy, like we were being watched, and every time I glanced behind us, I swore I saw movement. Dark shapes flitting between the trees, just out of sight. That's when I noticed Charlie was gone. One moment, he had been walking right behind me, silent and distant. The next, there was nothing but empty space where he should have been. "Charlie!" I shouted, spinning around. "Charlie!" Ben turned to me, his face pale. "This isn't right, man. This is messed up." We stood there, surrounded by towering trees, and I realized how small we were in this vast, ancient forest. I could feel it closing in on us, the silence wrapping around me like a vice. Ben was breathing hard, panic setting in. "We need to leave. Now." I nodded, but as we turned to run back the way we came, something stopped us. It wasn't a sound or a movement. It was the absence of both. The path was gone. The clearing we had camped in the night before, it was gone. We were surrounded by trees in every direction, the sky above barely visible through the dense canopy. And then the whispers started again. This time they were louder, closer. I looked at Ben, but his eyes were wide with terror, his lips moving silently as if he was trying to say something. His feet stumbled backward, and before I could reach out, he was gone. 1 second he was there, and the next the forest had swallowed him whole. I was alone. I stood there, my breath coming in shallow gasps, every muscle in my body frozen with fear. The whispering grew louder, the voices all around me now. I couldn't understand the words, but they filled my head, driving out every rational thought. I turned in circles, searching for any sign of my friends, but there was nothing. Only the trees, ancient and indifferent, and the voices, calling to me, pulling me deeper. Something moved at the edge of my vision. A tall, willowy figure, its limbs too long, too thin. It watched me from the shadows, just like it had the night before by the lake. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but I forced myself to move, stumbling through the trees, away from it, from whatever it was. but the forest wouldn't let me go. The trees seemed to twist around me, the path disappearing and reappearing at random. No matter how far I ran, no matter how fast, I always ended up back in the same place. The clearing by the lake, the water still and dark, the trees whispering their strange, ancient language. And then I saw it, the figure, standing at the edge of the water, waiting for me. I was the last one left. I don't remember how I got out of that forest. To this day, it's a blur, more like a fever dream than reality. The last thing I clearly recall was standing there, facing that figure by the lake, knowing I was the last one left. The whispers had surrounded me, a constant hum in my ears, growing louder with each passing second. I was sure I wouldn't leave that place, but somehow, I did. I woke up the next morning, lying on the edge of the road, where the forest thinned out. The early light of dawn filtered through the trees, and the ground beneath me was damp with dew. My limbs ached, my throat was dry, and my mind was shattered. For a long time, I just lay there, staring up at the canopy of leaves, trying to understand how I had gotten there. But I couldn't. I didn't even remember running. There was no sign of Ben, no sign of Lisa, no sign of Charlie. Just me and the endless, suffocating silence of the forest. I forced myself to get up, my body screaming in protest, and began stumbling down the road. My legs felt like lead, every step heavier than the last, but I had to keep moving. I didn't want to be anywhere near that forest anymore. I didn't look back, couldn't look back. I was terrified that if I did, I'd see that figure again, standing among the trees, watching me with its hollow, empty gaze. It wasn't until a passing car stopped, and the driver, a middle-aged woman, rolled down her window and asked if I was okay. I must have looked insane, stumbling out of the woods like that, covered in dirt and leaves, my clothes torn, my face pale and streaked with tears. I couldn't even form words. I just nodded, desperate to be anywhere but there. She offered me a ride to the nearest town, and I took it without a second thought. I didn't tell her what had happened. How could I? I didn't even understand it myself. I just said my friends and I had gotten lost in the woods, and we got separated. I didn't have my phone, no signal, no battery, and it all sounded reasonable enough, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She didn't ask questions, though. She just drove, the road winding away from the forest, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me with every mile we put between us and those trees. But the relief didn't last. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Ben, Lisa, Charlie, they were still missing. I called the police as soon as I got back to town, but I couldn't tell them the whole truth. How could I? I told them we had gone hiking, that we got separated, and that when I couldn't find my way back to the campsite. Sounded weak even to me, but what else could I say? That the forest had taken them? That there was something in those woods, something ancient and wrong, that had watched us the whole time? Search teams were sent out, but they didn't find anything. No tents, no campfire remains, no sign of Ben, Lisa, or Charlie. It was like they had just disappeared. The authorities wrote it off as an unfortunate accident. People get lost in the woods all the time, they said. Sometimes they never come back. But that explanation never sat right with me. I kept waiting for them to be found. Injured, dazed, wandering out of the trees like I had. But days turned into weeks and still nothing. And that's the part that haunts me the most. I got out, but they didn't. It's been months now, and I still have nightmares. I hear the whispers, soft at first, then growing louder until they drown out everything else. I see that figure, standing in the shadows, watching me with eyes that aren't there. I wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, convinced for a moment that I'm still in the forest, that I never left at all. Sometimes, When I'm alone, I hear faint murmurs, like the wind through the trees. But it's not the wind, I know that now. It's the same whispering I heard that night, and every time, it feels like it's getting closer, like the forest isn't done with me yet.